Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the Daily Factor. We are back with our normal programming. The day is Monday, July the 26th. My name is Faraz Patel, and we thank you so much for joining us. Well, South Africa has moved back to lockdown level 3, but there are a number of changes that have happened with regards to the curfew. Now has been moved to 10 o'clock, and ages between 18 and 34 will be able to register for their vaccination starting from the 1st of September. That's good news. If you are between those ages, I can tell you it's good news for me, so I can go ahead and get myself vaccinated. Of course, we will be discussing in length two aspects with regards to what had come out last night. The other is the first, of course, is the social relief grant, which has been reinstated. And another topic we are going to be discussing with regards to the looting that had happened 2 weeks ago and whether there should be a pardon with regards to that. So I'm going to be catching up with two members from an organization called the COVID-19 People's Association, just to give us an idea of what is going on. And then we will be touching base with Sahuk. Good news coming out of Saudi Arabia is that Umrah could be open to South Africans, but you have to have yourself vaccinated. I'm happy to say Petri Redingling is back with your market updates, and we're going to be doing a sports wrap-up. Well, let's go to our COVID-19 statistics from a national point of view. And South Africa recorded 9,178 new laboratory confirmed COVID-19 infections and 287 deaths, bringing the official death total to 69,775. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced a series of interventions to assist those who have been hardest hit by the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and the recent violent protests, which destroyed hundreds of businesses and livelihoods. They include the reinstatement of the social relief of a distress grant. The grant will be provided a monthly payment of 350 Rand to all those with no other means of income until March next year. Now, joining me to discuss this for two topics that we will be touching on later on, from the COVID-19's People Coalition, I have Tariq Jenkins and Nomacebo Mbayo. Guys, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having us.
Walaikum salam. Okay, we have Tawfiq with us. Tawfiq, I just want to touch on the COVID-19 relief the grant. Just your take on it, and is this a little too late? Were government in a knee-jerk reaction with regards to this?
Before I also hand over to my colleague who will be able to give an overview in terms of the campaign that has been launched over the last couple of months around the extension of the grant. The demands of the grant are, I think we need to also be clear in terms of how we differentiate between the special social relief grant and the need for a basic income grant. Now, we know that the demands that were put forward by a number of campaigns and a number of unions have included a 585 Rand recommendation, a demand on the social relief grant, which seems to be in part a slight improvement in terms of the fact that 350 is leveled beneath the poverty line. Quite considerably. I think that the fact that the extension of the grant till February next year, 2022, is a good sign in as far as how government has responded to the need for that extension. Secondly, there's also been an agreement to expand this grant to caregivers, for example. However, what's really important here is the agreement and the push towards a basic income grant, and I think that on the one hand, while the measure of response in as far as the need for the instatement of a social relief grant has been heard, there is huge concern around the fact that the demand of a minimum of 585 has not actually been met, and the fact that the call for a basic income grant in of itself has not actually been responded to. I think that, and we'll talk a bit more later as we express, some of our understanding around the looting and the response by government in as far as its deployment of the South African Police Service, as well as the military, which ostensibly pits an environment of criminalizing poor working class Black people within the context of a pandemic, where the vulnerabilities that exist have been exacerbated in large, due to the fact that government has inadequately responded to the needs of acute needs, or as have been resonated by communities across the board in terms of how it relates to this health pandemic.
All right, let me bring in Nomagcebo. Nomagcebo, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. 350 Rand, and when I look at that number, I just feel it's just too low, isn't it?
Yes, so we finally are really happy that our government has finally brought back the social relief grant, but 350 is too little. You can agree with us. On the first point is that even the first time they were trying to take away the 350, we were standing outside, SASSA offices. I was standing outside Bellville SASSA offices. Other comrades were standing outside SASSA offices saying that it is not feasible that they are taking away the 350. But the reality is that if you take your calculator right now and calculate, you'll see that 350 is actually 11 Rand, some odds per day. And if you look at that, even the price of a loaf of bread doesn't amount to that. It's even less than an amount of a loaf of bread. 350 Rand amounts to 11 Rand 58 cents per day. Who can live out of that? And
okay, we seem to be breaking up there with Nomagcebo. Nomagcebo, can you hear us? Okay, yeah, I think we seem to be breaking up there with Nomagcebo. We're going to try and see if we can get her back. Tariq, I want to come back to you while we're trying to get Nomagcebo back on air. Of course, network problems that she is having, and the question around 350. And I want to touch on the basic income grant, because before we came on air, we were discussing, should there be or we do have Nomagcebo back. Nomagcebo, you can complete what you were saying.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that 350 is not enough. We as the campaign around hashtag pay the grants, we demand that 585 be paid. But there are also other demands on the table which are more reasonable. You look at the 1.260, a lot of proposals are being put on the table, and you look at that and you see that it's actually something that people can live out of. But one more thing, the caregivers are now also given a chance to apply and be able to benefit from this 350 grants. What I'm saying is that they should also be given back pay, because the first time they were told they were not eligible to apply. In fact, they were, because women, it's actually women at the receiving line on this. It's actually women who are always caregivers and who are taking care of big households, and 350 is not enough. So women and caregivers that are being given a chance now to apply should be given back pay, but also demand that it doesn't end there. 350 is not enough. We're demanding 585. Even beyond that. I'm happy that it's now being supported. More people are coming to the table and saying, let us get a basic income guarantee, which is very much important for people of South Africa, for the things that are happening in the country, for us to allow people to be able to benefit from this.
Nomagcebo, we just have a few minutes left. I just want to get one more answer out of you. President Cyril Ramaphosa said that the basic income grant is something that government is working on. What is the amount that you would like to see the poor and the marginalized and the vulnerable people of our country receiving?
So we are now saying we are proposing the 585, but even that is not enough. So we are looking into the 12, the 1,260. That is much more. That will sustain people. You know, with the first round, when people are applying for the 350, I had quite a number of people, and some of them said I was able to go and look for work using this money, buying myself a ticket, and also people felt some sense of belonging because you are able now to go and buy your own toiletries. But 350 is not enough. It's never enough. It doesn't end there. We're going to challenge that our government must put a better offer on the table, because what we want to see is the people of South Africa being able to depend on something that's more adequate, something that they can, assist themselves, especially those caregivers who are taking care of these big households. And women are the forefront of this because women are more vulnerable and they are in need, and they're supposed to be supported by our government.
Okay, Nomagcebo Mbayo, we'd like to say thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Nomagcebo Mbayo, excuse me for that, the COVID-19's People's Coalition member and an activist from that organization, just giving us an assessment of the social relief grant, the 350 Rand, that has been reinstated by government. After the break, we are going to be shifting the attention, the same organization, but a gentleman I did have earlier on, Tariq Jenkins. We're going to be talking about, should there be a pardon for those who went ahead and of course, committed to looting, and whether this is down to abject poverty and they just had no other option but to go ahead and do what they do. So we're going to be weighing up the pros and cons with regards to that. Do stay tuned to the Daily Factor. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back to the Daily Factor. I'm still joined by Tariq Jenkins from the COVID-19's People Coalition. Tariq, let's start off with, of course, two aspects to this. The potential pardoning of the looters, but on the other side, the raids on especially many of the poor people's homes, of course, to allegedly go ahead and recover goods that were stolen. So, Tariq, I just wanted to ask you, let's start with the second part of this. Police going into poor people's homes, and I'm specifically referring to informal settlements and townships, going there with undue force and forcing them to go ahead and show slips. Surely that is a dismantling of humanity, isn't it?
I would agree with you 100% on that. I think that one of our major concerns since the inception of national lockdown regulations has been the concern of upscaling fascism in as far as the deployment of policing, the military, and law enforcement. Here we have a classic situation in terms of a situation which was caused by a very distinct and calculated form of political sort of uprisal, and that there has to be a differentiation when we talk about high levels of intelligence beginning to investigate and find the elements that have been responsible for infrastructural damage, for calculated, targeted sabotage in KwaZulu-Natal and in the Gauteng predominantly, and that this political intervention that was made via these kinds of very calculated forms of upheaval became a matchstick that lit up already pre-existing vulnerabilities in our society that have become increasingly more and more exacerbated as time goes along. The C-19 crisis has put a magnifying glass on existing apartheid infrastructure, on inequality, in as far as equity is concerned, in as far as the rollout across all sectors of government that has denied a meaningful integrated response for civil society and communities on the board. So the immediate default of wanting to deploy a police and military to sort of deal with these kinds of situations without a sensible integrated approach with communities in terms of how to deal with issues like this, will result basically in the criminalization of poor working class Black people, and here we have a situation where there is a very little range of clear analysis in as far as how judgment is being deployed, and also I think that even within the logic of both legal recourse and the logic in terms of how are we responding to this particular crisis. For example, one of the major critiques is that what is the logic that underpins any government in the context of this kind of pandemic to want to destroy food and goods of this nature without actually going into a very careful, clear discussion in terms of the appropriate ways around which one can apply the law, apply justice, but also respond to the basic needs that are being called for in our communities, and especially the most vulnerable communities who are on the coalface of this pandemic.
And Tariq, that's just it, because it seems as if government is clearly out of touch with especially the vulnerable people of our society, because I'm just trying to understand, you've got goods, okay, they were stolen, but to destroy it, as you say, it just defies logic.
It does defy logic. We're talking about a situation where communities are fighting tooth and nail for 585 rand, which was extremely well articulated by my colleague as being already grossly insufficient in terms of dealing with the basic requirements of human dignity within the context of this crisis. Now, here we have a situation where the South African police services are now being deployed to retain goods and food, and then are being sort of ordered to destroy this. It just begs a whole range of questions in as far as what is the clear level of logic, and also the levels of integration as far as where do communities have a say on what has happened. I think that one of the major concerns, and this has been ongoing, is when you look at the history of the South African Police Service and how its orientation in many ways is still connected to an apartheid past in terms of how Black bodies are identified primarily as particular kinds of threat, which inordinately are there to be kept at bay in order to maintain certain means of production. And so when we talk about who and what is government deploying its resources to protect, I think the principled mandate should coordinate itself against a moral courage around principally pushing as much resources to the alleviation of the pain and misery by those who are most in need and by those who are most vulnerable in our communities. And I think that based on that particular kind of thinking, surely there has to be a range of alternatives in as far as how we look at why the destruction of food when large swaths of communities across the country are in dire need of not just nutrition but all kinds of forms of support, that this somehow goes against what should be a communal sense of thinking in terms of how we need to coordinate all efforts together with civil society and communities in immediately alleviating the pressures on the ground. I think that the basic income grant, the relief fund at this stage are not just, they should not only be posited in as far as relief in as far as food is concerned, but these things should be considered in as far as national safety and security. Instead of billions of rand that are being deployed, for example, in the manifest increase of security forces like the police, like law enforcement and military, there is something to say about the effectiveness of providing at the heart of the home and within the intimacy of local governments in the context of the families of being able to provide for themselves sufficient grants like this, because that in a very clear way will help to reduce the set of circumstances that allow this kind of ignition to to blow up in terms of how we've seen the situation and how we've seen the violence catalyze over the last week.
Tariq, one final question without legitimizing the criminality part of what had happened with regards to the looting. So, of course, 11.4 million people unemployed, that's a large number. We don't even have to exaggerate how big that number is. And a lot of those who went on the looting, listening to what you heard on the people of the ground, they did it for their children. And of course, any parent would do anything for their child. But there were those criminals who, you know, I'm speaking of one person who, of course, was a CEO of an investment company who went ahead and capitalized on it. Now, there have been calls for the pardoning of those looters. So I just want to get your reaction to it. How do we supposedly differentiate between those who did it out of desperation and those who said, hey, let me just join the crowd and take whatever I want to take?
Again, this cannot be a one-size-fits-all paradigm, because at the same token, you are allowing government officials, you're allowing millionaires and billionaires who actually took advantage of the situation and decide to take, Panasonic televisions and put them in, 1.5 million rand worth 4x4s and drive them back to Sandton. Surely that cannot be accepted. I think that, again, where is the reasoning and logic based on a particular kind of thinking that is in service of poor and vulnerable people in this country? And this is where an integrated approach in terms of how we will come to the rationale of assessing the situation must engage civil society, must engage communities in as far as how communities feel they have been disenfranchised, and how they will also have a say in as far as how this situation will be put to rest appropriately and in ways that do not damage or re-damage poor people within the communities, especially women, and also in ways that do not set a precedent where those who have access and privilege and political clout are able to abuse and re-abuse themselves conveniently on the stroke of what in this case would have been a broad-based sort of exercise of extraction in various forms.
Tariq Jenkins, we'd like to say thank you so much for joining us. Shukran, assalamu alaikum, and all the best, and continue the good work that the organization does.
Afwan, walaikum salam, and shukran for having me on your show.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. That's Tariq Jenkins from the COVID-19 People Coalition, just discussing with us. First, we spoke about the COVID-19 relief gun from Nomatrebo Mbayo, and then after that, we spoke to Tariq Jenkins about, the raids that had been happening, but especially raids in those of the vulnerable and the marginalized. And what just caught my attention when watching on various other media channels was when they asked them for a slip, and I just thought to myself, my word, that just destroys a person's humanity right over there. So yeah, that's how it's currently at the moment with regards to President Cyril Ramaphosa's announcement last night. 350 rand social relief grant that has been announced, the reinstatement of it. The question is 350 really enough to sustain our continued unemployment and really poverty abject society right here in South Africa? Coming up after the break is our community news. We'll be discussing Umrah and the possible return for South African citizens. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to the Daily Factor. This is our community news section. Now, following a successful Hajj, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has announced that the resumption for Umrah for international pilgrims will begin on the 1st of Muharram of the Islamic calendar 1443, which corresponds to around the 9th or the 10th of August. Now, these countries include India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Egypt, Turkey, Argentina, Brazil, and most importantly, South Africa. Now, joining me to discuss this, I'd like to welcome the South African Hajj and Umrah Council President, Shaheen Essop. Shaheen, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah so much for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khairan once again for the opportunity to share with you.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, Shaheen. This is good news, isn't it?
It certainly is, from the point of view that the international arena is now being opened for Umrah. However, there is obviously conditions, that go with this. And some of the countries that you actually mentioned, unfortunately, still on the, on the red list or on the prohibited list. And as a result, these countries' citizens must go to a third country or a first country before entering the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for a period of 14-day quarantine. For South Africans, while we welcome this news and we are elated by it, I think the big problems, unfortunately, is that it becomes an expensive exercise. Because if we look at the countries that currently allow South Africans to enter into it, it's predominantly the European countries, some of the European countries, a few of the African countries, one Middle Eastern country, and the rest, unfortunately, seems close to us. Now, if one just looks at it, for example, let's use France as an example. If we were to say that a person going for Umrah is going to spend 14 days in France, can you imagine what a sort of one-star hotel is going to cost you in euro, for that 14 days? That's going to be a major problem because that's for your own expense. And then you've obviously got to have additional legs of your flight rather than what we were used to or accustomed to, flying either via Dubai or via Etihad or via, directly via Jeddah or even, through Egypt for that matter. So the costs are going to be quite astronomical. And over and above that, one needs to also ask, what type of Umrah are you going to perform? In the past, pre-COVID, people were really enjoying 14 days in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, sometimes even a little bit longer than that. You probably find that you're only going to be allowed 10 days in the kingdom, 3 days probably in quarantine. Then you perform Umrah at a specified slot that's been allocated to you. Then you're going to have to go to Medina to perform ziyarah and then leave. So in all, if you look at people who are actually working, it's a 25 to 30-day trip, to spend 6 or 7 days in the two holy mosques. One's got to ask yourself the question, if you weigh up the pros and the cons, is it really worth it? Because there are no nafil tawafs being performed. One could see it now with Hajj as well. People came in and performed their tawaful qudum. They then went, on the 5 days of Hajj. After that, they performed tawaful ifada or ziyarah, and then they performed their tawaful wida. Now, how do you really enjoy or, encapsulate that this is going to be a situation? Furthermore, if you look at a situation of a family of 6 people, you need 3 rooms. You can't do a 6-bedded room or a 5-bedded room anymore. Because of the COVID situation, they're only allowing 2 people per room. So if you've got 4 kids, you've got to have your own room, you've got to have 2 in another room and 2 in the third room. That escalates the costs again. In terms of busing, they talk about groups of 25 because they're not allowing more than that due to the fact that they're keeping some of the seats empty in terms of COVID distancing and social distancing. So those costs are also going to be important from that point of view. But obviously, the most important thing is going to be the double vaccine, that you need to have. And a lot of people at this point in time in South Africa are still waiting for that vaccine. Some have taken it. We've seen 6 million people take the first shot. We're waiting for the second shots to come. So there's a lot of obstacles in this thing, but alhamdulillah, we welcome it. My only concern is that it's going to be a trip for the wealthy or the ultra wealthy at this point in time.
And that's what I wanted to get to, Shaheen, that it's now becoming something for the wealthy because, as you mentioned, the green zone countries. Now, let's just say you have to fly to France. So you take an Air France flight, and then from Air France, you either take your Emirates or your Etihad or whoever flies into Saudi Arabia. And I think that just for me just makes it so difficult, doesn't it? Because if you are from a middle class or working class family, you're looking at the astronomical costs of all of this, and you're saying to yourself, here's a perfect chance. We've been in lockdown for over 1.5 years. I would like to go to the Holy Land, but I just cannot afford it.
Absolutely. And, you just go back a few weeks and you look at the cost of Hajj, for the 65,000 people internally. There were 3 packages. The cheapest package was 55,000 odd rand. The second package was about 60,000. And the premium package was about 75,000. Now, that was for 5 days of Hajj. That's not even talking about hotels or anything like that. In 2019, if we look at some of our average packages for 6 weeks with couple rooms, Makkah, Medina, and then sharing in Azizia, or even couple rooms in Azizia, it was costing you about 75,000 Rand. And that included your tanazzul, it included your airfare, it included your camp pricing, etc. So, one's got to compare apples with apples. You got to, work out whether it's worth your while. But yeah, it's a very, very grave situation that we find ourselves in with COVID at this point in time. And therefore, the only thing that we as an ummah can do is to pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes COVID from the dunya so that we can get to reasonable normality, so that people can have freedom of movement in very different ways, whether it be economically, whether it be for business, whether it be for, travel socially, or even for umrah, religious travel in that regard.
Shane, I know we're about 320, 330 days away from the next Hajj, inshallah, but just looking, just looking forward to that, because look, Allah only knows what's going to happen with regards to COVID-19. But vaccinations are starting to get on the go here in South Africa. We see globally, the certain countries that are, of course, fully vaccinating or achieving that herd immunity for its citizens. Do you think, inshallah, that we could have South Africans going for Hajj? And if they are going for Hajj, do you think that the restrictions are going to be quite tight?
Well, let's do two things. Let's just talk about, first of all, we can't use a crystal ball and look into the future. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if we look at last year, 60,000 people were expected to come for Hajj, 15,000 from within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and 65,000 from international countries. Obviously, we would have been part of that, had they dissected it and passed it along, throughout the world. Unfortunately, the Kingdom made a decision at that particular point in time. We are hopeful that South Africans are going to be allowed to come in next year. Likewise, every other country around the world. We're very hopeful in that regard. The unfortunate thing is that we need to make sure that, we fulfill the obligations of what is required to maintain social distancing and to fight COVID in its best way possible. The ironic thing and the unfortunate thing is that we're still finding people in South Africa who say that, we don't want to take the vaccine. We're not going to take the vaccine. How are you then going to enter the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia if that becomes a prerequisite in terms of what they want, for Hajj or for Umrah, as you can see right now? Are you going to falsify documentation? Are you going to do something in that regard? Then, the trip that you're going to be making is in vain, unfortunately. So one needs to look at it in a perspective that this is becoming the new norm. And if you want to travel abroad, you're going to need the vaccine. And inshallah, we hope that, by next Hajj, we would have a reasonable amount of herd immunity, as you've indicated. And, we hope that we'll have a reasonable amount of people that will go for Hajj. And yes, we do believe that there is going to be a restrictive process, because it's not just going to be a magic wand and COVID is going to disappear. Or it's not just going to be something that is going to happen in that way. We continuously make dua that Allah takes it away from us. But there is still going to be that concern, and that concern is reflected in what was shown in the last Hajj of 1442.
Just to wrap up the conversation, Shaheen, and that's exactly it when you mention about vaccines. That is important, isn't it? If we can get our people vaccinated, then that trip can happen. If you want to go for Umrah or inshallah looking ahead to Hajj next year, I mean, this does really make life easy, but vaccination has to happen.
Absolutely. That is very, very important. People mustn't get to the point where we're saying that we believe in the vaccination. We believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because at the end of the day, everything is by the ordainment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at that particular point in time, we need to make sure that, we tie our camel or we take the necessary precaution. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would never have given people the ability to develop these vaccines if it was not good for humanity.
Shaheen Essop, the South African Hajj and Umrah Council President, we say Jazakallah to you for allowing us your time.
Jazakallah khairan for the opportunity. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That's Shaheen Essop from SAHUG. Let me just bring you the COVID-19 statistics from the Muslim community. And unfortunately, 15 new deaths were recorded, with 4 of them coming from Gauteng. May Allah grant the Marhumi Janatul Firdaus, inshallah, ameen, and make it easy on their families. Coming up after the break, it's our market update. He is back. It's Petri Redingling Hayes. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to the Daily Fact. It's time for your market updates, and we're happy that he's back. Petri Redingling, Hayes Portfolio Manager at Herenia Capital Advisors. Petri, wow, 2 weeks. We haven't seen you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a rough 2 weeks, but I'm going to leave it up to you to go ahead and give us the market updates.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, and apologies for the absence. I think the last 2 weeks have been a bit of a wild time for most. So I think it was just important to kind of prioritize clients and making sure that everyone's okay and that kind of thing. So yeah, a lot of that dust is starting to settle. I guess there's still quite a bit to happen. I know we're under deadline for Friday. What happens if there's some people that are still demanding former President Zuma's release? So we'll see how that turns out. At this stage, it seems to have lowered in terms of the risk it poses, but we shall see. We've had a decent couple of weeks actually since the last time we spoke. US markets, for example, have gone on to make new all-time highs last Friday. Today they are softening up a little bit, but generally the market is still relatively strong. I think the biggest risk posed to, I suppose, the global market environment at this stage is the risk of rising interest rates in the US. At some point, the US economy, currently is being given emergency stimulus. At some point, there has to be an acknowledgement that, well, the emergency is mostly over. Consumer confidence, consumer sentiment, even mobility is all higher than it was pre the pandemic, right? And mobility is being tracked by things like use of public transport, walking, and sort of traveling in a car. This is data that we get from Apple mobility data, and we can see that particularly in pretty much most of the countries except for two, being Indonesia and Malaysia, mobility, people moving around, is actually higher than it was pre January 2019 or 2020. Sorry, so pre-lockdowns, people are moving around more, and I think that is starting to show that the economy is coming back on a global perspective in the US and all over, is sort of starting to recover quite a bit, and it's coming back to that pre-pandemic sort of level, which kind of throws into question, well, how much longer can we have central banks, keep pumping money and emergency stimulus into the market when the emergency is seemingly over, right? So that, I think, at this stage is one of the bigger risks out there in the marketplace. So obviously, it's going to take a long time before it plays out, because interest rates in the US aren't expected to go up for quite some time. So we'll be keeping our eyes sort of next month. There's the Jackson Hole Symposium, the Economic Symposium at Jackson Hole in the US. So we'll see what guidance we get from that. Later this week, we do have FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee in the US, making an interest rate decision, but it's mostly expected for that to remain unchanged at this stage, with the market kind of expecting us to get more bearish kind of, or hawkish kind of guidance next month at the Jackson Hole Symposium. So we'll see how that plays out. As for today's markets, our market is not having too shabby of a day. Special shout out to the platinum miners that are doing really, really well. Anglo American Platinum, for example, is up at this stage 8.5% on the back of announcing an enormous dividend. They're paying out 100% of headline earnings per share, and adding a special dividend to that equation as well. So this share price is really performing well, lifting the entire sort of precious metals and mining index, if you will. But let's get into it. Top 40 index is up just shy of 0.5% at this stage. The top 40 future is trading at 44 basis points up, so that's also just shy of 0.5%. So a relatively strong day, I guess. Not in all sectors though. The Resource 20 index obviously doing very well, 4.15% higher. Industrial 25 index though is down by 2.25%. Financial 15 index is down by 0.4%. And then, as mentioned, the precious metals and mining index leading the way, 4.5% higher on that one. Unfortunately, though, the retail is not doing so good. They are down around 1% or just over 1% on that, or on the day. In other markets in Europe, in FTSE, or in the FTSE 100 index in London is up 5 basis points, so very, very slightly green. Germany down by around 1/3% on the DAX. In France, the CAC 40 index is up around 1/4%. In the US, a bit of a mixed bag. S&P 500 currently down 0.1%, while the NASDAQ is up 0.1%. and the Dow Jones Industrial Average is down just over 0.1%. So on the big sort of heavyweight large cap indices, not really a lot of movement. But if you look at the smaller cap index, the Russell 2000, that's up just over 1% at this stage. So it seems a bit of a reversal what we've seen over the last couple of days. So we'll see whether or not this kind of sets a trend, or if it's kind of just a once-off or a short-term thing. But what we have been seeing is that the smaller cap businesses are mostly trading down over the last 2 weeks, while the large cap businesses are trading up. So that means the index is going up, but on a smaller and smaller number of shares. So that reversed today, or is currently the inverse. But these types of trends take a long time to develop. So if we continue to see the Russell 2000 underperform the bigger indices, then that might be a sign of a bit more turbulence in future. But for now, we're having a relatively decent day. I should also mention that, and this is probably some of the bigger news I should have mentioned at the beginning. I just want to get the latest price here. Naspers is having a really, really bad day today. That is down 7% on the day, following Tencent being down 7.7% in China, in the sort of early morning session. And this is on the back of Chinese authorities really clamping down on tech companies. Again, they've now said to Tencent that, there's one of their subsidiaries, Tencent Music Entertainment, holds a lot of royalties in the sort of music industry, and those will have to be handed over essentially to government. And that putting quite a bit of pressure on on Tencent or Chinese tech in general. Also, they effectively nationalized all the education stocks or education companies over the weekend as well. And we see some of the education counters, Chinese education companies listed in all over the world, being down as much as 30% on the day. So that Chinese sort of crackdown on tech is really starting to cause a bit of pressure, which is obviously playing through to us because Naspers is down quite heavily, which is what's bringing down the industrial average index as well. So we're really being saved by the commodity stocks today for the most part. The miners and BHP Billiton also up close on 4% on the day. So I guess what we're trading higher on is that, the evidence that there is quite a bit of economic recovery happening on a global scale. And also, demand for energy projections, for example, is very, very good at this stage. So it shows that the world is starting to, wake up and start to operate again. Anyway, moving on to commodities, the gold price slightly lower, about 0.25% down, $1,797.05 a fine ounce. Platinum price up by just under 0.5% at $1,066 exactly a fine ounce. Palladium up by 1%, physical rhodium down by 2.7%. Rhodium has been very wild lately and has had a huge push. So a 3% pullback is not really the end of the world at this stage. Energy prices, Brent crude oil price up 0.2%, trading in London at $73.57 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate crude oil, very slightly positive, but trading at $72.11 a barrel in Chicago. Then looking at the currencies, the rand actually a bit stronger versus the dollar at this stage. It did trade as high as 14.99 earlier today. It's currently trading at 14.83, so that's slightly stronger after a very weak start. But versus the euro and the pound, we're weaker on both fronts, 0.25% weaker versus the euro at 17.51, and about 0.5% weaker versus the pound at 20.49. And then lastly, looking at Bitcoin for those who are interested, whopping 12.85% up today, knocking on that $40,000 door again. It's currently trading at $38,507.
Petri, in just 1.5 minutes, I just need you to just give me your take on the monetary policy's announcement for 3.5% of the interest rate. It has been kept unchanged. While the Reserve Bank, did their hand have to push towards keeping it that way? And do you think we could get more interest rate hikes due to this?
Well, I think that, from a global perspective, we're kind of towing the line by keeping monetary policy very accommodating at 3.5%. I think it's the lowest that it had ever been. And it's also, been here for a while. So there's a number of different things. I mean, obviously, the Reserve Bank's mandate is to keep inflation in the band between 3 and 6%, and they'll respond accordingly when it reaches the upper or lower end of that band, right? At this stage, we are in a situation where our economy is struggling quite a bit. I guess we'll have to see what the events of 2 weeks ago in KZN and a little bit in Gauteng, how much that influences inflation, because there's obviously been a lot of supply chain disruptions and that type of stuff, and whether or not that feeds through to food price inflation. For example, a number of chicken farms were essentially destroyed, along with millions of chickens, right? So what does that do to the price of food, for example, or the price of chicken? And is that a long-term inflation impact? And does that justify an interest rate increase or not, right? So for now, I think the Reserve Bank is kind of playing this. We need to stimulate the economy. We need to keep interest rates low. We need to get people working and spending again. And I think unless there's a major sort of global policy shift where we start seeing growth really accelerating, I don't foresee that our interest rate will go up too much. I do think that we'll probably act in lockstep with the US. So when they started rising interest rates, we'll probably start rising interest rates, or raising interest rates. But until then, I think we probably just, see low interest rates for another while. And, that has its benefits for those who are in the position to be able to pay off debt. Now's a very, very good time to do that.
Yeah, interesting to see what will happen. Patrick Reding-Linghase, we'd like to say thank you so much. We'll see you again, same time, same place tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
You have a great day also. Patrick Reding-Linghase from Herenia Capital Advisors. He's the organization's portfolio manager. Well, that's all we have for you here on The Daily Factor. From myself, Faraz Patel, the rest of the technical team, Kabir, Linda, Johnny, Alan, and Jesse. We'll see you again tomorrow, right here on ITV Networks. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.